Okay, hi Vermont history students. What's up? This is the video for Unit 4, and the first town meeting is completed, I guess, at this point. 6 of you responded to 2 of the questions, and then 7 of you responded to another one. And the results were rather ambiguous. On the canal, it seemed pretty clear that downhillers, the business-oriented people, thought the canal was a great idea, and for the most part, uphillers thought the canal was a bad idea. The textbook and the poem were a bit more ambiguous as far as those results went. Some people are sort of neutral even on the textbook and on the poem. The poem actually does celebrate the election of Isaac Ticonor to the governorship. It's a downhill poem in the end. The lesson to be learned from the downhill poem, is for uphillers, whenever downhillers say nice things about you, get really skeptical, get really suspicious, because it's probably because they want something. But it seemed like the town meeting really went well, and people got the concept, and it was cool. Have fun with those, you know, and look at other people's results. And the point of the town meetings is to measure unity. They're a way for us to see at that point in time how unified the state is. If up and down all agree that a canal should be built, or that it's a great poem, or whatever, they're measuring sticks, then the state that's some evidence that the state was unified at the time. If uphillers and downhillers totally disagree about all the primary documents, that's supposedly, in theory, evidence of a divided state. And be aware, you know, that it's going to evolve enormously, which is something we're going to talk about now. The categories are not static, so be ready for that to happen. The discussion question for Unit 4 is up. And also, I went on at length about the papers in the previous video for Unit 3. Write me a paper by Monday. 2 people asked me, would Monday be fine? The answer is yeah, sure. Monday would be fine. Give me a really clear answer at the beginning and in the conclusion of your paper. Was the state becoming more or less unified? Was it more or less unified at the end of the period you're examining than at the beginning? If your answer is more, it's fine. More or less, same. They're all good. You know, I'm not grading you on your answer. I'm grading you on how well you defend it. I hope that you will use the class notes that I have up, the textbook, and hopefully throw in an article or 2 from the articles folder that exists in each part. And then that'll be great. That'll be all the information you need in order to answer the question intelligently. You know, it's in history. History is a very personal thing. I want you to be able to tell the history of the state like it's a story, and that's why I really don't like to give too many directions and too much guidance. You know, strict rules about how the assessment papers are structured as far as the chronology goes. You can start your paper in the 1760s as your starting point for comparative purposes. You can begin it in the 1780s. You can conclude it in the 1830s or the 1850s, just however the story makes sense to you. Just think of it this way. So far as we've had the course, in the period that we've studied, was the state growing more or less unified? Was it more or less same? Anything's fine. Have citations. I'm not a stickler for form, but I do need the page number, author's name or title, page number, so I can retrace your steps. Would be great. And and just get me one, and that would be fine. But give me a nice clear answer. The way that the course goes so far is there's like Unit 1 was basically the state. It's really ambiguous. The state comes out of a really ambiguous and unknowable origins ideologically, and therefore that's great because it means that people can argue endlessly about who the founders were and what a real Vermonter is, and the founders are people like me, and that can be used on both sides, which is wonderful. The second unit, really what I want you to do there, the early republic, the revolution, was to get you acquainted with the uphill-downhill idea and how that forms. It's geographical, but of course it's about employment. It's ideological more than anything else. The third unit was about the 2 most important things, the single thing that's most important about uphillers and downhillers, being that uphillers don't see the big picture, and downhillers don't understand uphillers at all. They just don't get them. They don't understand why they do the things that they do. This fourth section traces the period of capitalist transformation, and those of you who've taken the first half of the survey know that America went from being pre-capitalist to overwhelmingly capitalist between about 1800 and the 1840s. What happens over the course of centuries in England and Europe happens over the course of decades on the East Coast. But in the interior of America, upstate New York, Vermont, it seems like it happens overnight. The Erie Canal and the Champlain Canal running up to Lake Champlain is generally considered sort of like, you know, your model, but also in real practical ways thrusts capitalist imperatives into the countryside. And the 1820s and 30s are a period of enormous change and enormous social ferment. And that's what part one of the 4 parts of Unit 4 is about the great religious ferment of that era. People experimented with all kinds of great ideas. You know, there was free love cults and spiritualists and enormous numbers of revivals and new denominations that rise up, and Mormons, and it goes on, and the Putney community, which practiced free love. The question you want to be thinking about that makes sense out of the first part of Unit 4 is when change is rapid and originates outside the state, does that drive the imagined community of Vermonters apart, or does it bring them together? You're going to see this a number of times in the future. You'll see it with summer tourism in the 1890s. You'll see it with the construction of interstate highways in the 1950s and 60s. Those things produce enormously rapid change, and it's change that originates from outside forces. What does this do to the imagined community of Vermonters? Do Vermonters pull together as a community when they're faced by rapid change? Or is the result that they get driven deeply apart? The second section of the Unit 4 is about the mid-hiller dilemma. And you know, understand that the uphill-downhill thing is a spectrum. It's not just 2 monolithic camps, but rather there's a range of a scale on which people are, you know, exist. I mean, I'm very, very downhill, but there's uphill elements to me, I imagine. I own a chainsaw. But there are people who exist right in the middle, of course. And I give you 2 examples in this section. On the one hand, you had Justin Morrill, a U.S. senator who was enormously popular, and it's because he was able to place himself in the middle of the uphill-downhill spectrum. When uphillers looked at him, they saw themselves and associated themselves with him, and downhillers looked at him and thought of him as like them. And the result was that he was impregnable politically. He was enormously powerful and had no challenges because he played the line between uphill and downhill so well. The contrary example is Zadok Thompson, who was a UVM professor who had grown up very uphill in Bridgewater, Vermont, and left his uphill world behind. Once he'd lived in Burlington long enough, they didn't want him back. But he never really fit in Burlington. They never made him a full professor. He was always an adjunct, even though he was brilliant. And a good example is that of his finding it very hard to play the line between uphill and downhill was in 1853, when the state had a referendum to become a dry state and to have prohibition. He wasn't a drinker, but the downhillers wanted prohibition. They wanted uphillers to stop drinking, and most downhillers in this age of ferment had taken the temperance oath already. Uphillers wanted to continue drinking, and what happened is that Zadok Thompson, in solidarity sort of with his uphill relatives, refused to take the temperance oath, and therefore he never became a full professor. And so the question that then this brings up is, should it be easy to be a mid-hiller? Should it be easy to walk the line between uphill and downhill? Is that evidence of a strong imagined community? Or is the imagined community really strong when it's really hard to place yourself right in the middle, to be a mid-hiller? Are you going to be, is the imagined community strong when you're a target and both sides end up hating you? Ask someone on the Fish and Wildlife Commission today how much the uphillers and downhillers like what they do. If you can't make anyone happy, is that evidence of a strong or a weak imagined community? Should it be easy to be a mid-hiller? That's what you want to ask yourself. Part 3 of this unit is about Catholics, and just to be brief, what the Catholic part is about is, and it's really fun to do in class in person, and probably really hard to do in this kind of format. But the point of it is that I want you to use the Catholic experience in the 1830s and 40s and 50s to appreciate that it's not always the same. Uphill and downhill change enormously as categories, and this is a good example. And why it's a good example is that the first Catholic priest in Vermont, Jeremiah O'Callaghan, founded the Diocese of Burlington, was based in Burlington, and he found that the Protestants in Burlington hated Catholics' guts. It was like a red flag in front of a bull, you know, so much so that the first Catholic church in Burlington, which was located right back behind where the pub and brewery is now, got burned down, St. Anne's, in 1838. He just found that the downhill elite totally disdained Catholics. There's other, of course, there's an African American story and there's a Native American story, but Catholics are an enormous percentage of the state population. So anyway, in downhill community, the Catholics found it very hard to fit in. They tended to separate themselves. Irish lived down on the waterfront, right, you know, sort of where the Battery is now. Catholics tend to congregate, French Canadians congregated over along the water in Winooski, and they had their own institutions. But what O'Callaghan found out, to his horror, when he went out into the countryside, was that French Canadians and Irish people in small towns, among the uphillers, had blended in. They had converted to Methodism or whatever else, or Baptists. They had married Protestant women or Protestant men. O'Callaghan thought this was horrible. He did not want Catholic assimilation. But what the point is that it was easier to become a Vermonter. You could become a Vermonter faster if you're an outsider, uphill than downhill, which is the opposite of today. Of course, it's much easier to become a downhiller in Burlington now than it is in Belvedere or Wheelock or some other small town like that. So now, of course, I hope you appreciate what I'm saying. It's a lot easier to be called a Vermonter, to acquire that designation, downhill than uphill today. But back then, it was faster and easier for a Catholic to become a Vermonter uphill than downhill. So it changes and evolves enormously, and I just hope that you appreciate, because that's what's really cool and interesting about it. We're in a very different place as far as uphill and downhill go now than we used to be. Section 4, the last part, is about abolition, and which is a fantastic and interesting story. But what it's really about is railroads. And it was in the late 1840s that the first railroads came in. The Rutland Railroad, the Central Vermont Railroad, both completed in the late 1840s. The Passumpsic and Connecticut River Railroad completed in 1850. And so what happens as a result of railroads is that canals are very democratic because you can have lots and lots of stops along the way. But railroads are very undemocratic as far as towns go because what they do is favor the places where there are stations. And so what happens is small number of towns get favored because they have railroad stations over towns that don't. A good example would be like Pomfret, which in the day of stagecoaches had hotels in North Pomfret and South Pomfret and Pomfret Center. And it had craftsmen in each of those places. And each of these little villages is a thriving little village. But when the railroad bypasses Pomfret, out go the downhillers mostly. The craftsmen, and also because things are being shipped in from outside, you don't need harness makers and barrel makers in small villages anymore. So what happens is that a lot of craftsmen, after railroads come in, they pick up and leave small towns where there's no stations that railroads didn't favor, and end up moving to big towns, Rutland or Burlington or Montpelier, or they move out west. They move to Michigan or whatever. And so gradually what happens that, whereas in the initial period, of course, downhillers and uphillers are right there in the same towns together across the state. They're very close in contact with each other. Gradually what's happening by the time you get to the 1850s and 60s is that in a lot of small towns, the downhillers are leaving. And uphillers are sort of coming to occupy their own space, and downhillers are coming to occupy their own space in the big cities, and they don't have that much contact with each other anymore. Generally, the interpretation at the time among downhillers was that it wasn't a matter of employment or natural evolution of the economy. The thing was that the most ambitious and entrepreneurial people were leaving the small villages, the small towns, and leaving them bereft of talent and blah, blah, blah like this. But really what was happening was that as the local economies evolved because of railroads, the people who were most superfluous to those local economies were leaving. Craftsmen, the